Someone messaged me asking if I'd done a video about splicing billets. Well, I thought I had, but I had a good look and I hadn't. Well, I've got a couple of billets lying around. They're very much scruffy, non-ideal billets. I mean, you can see there we've got the centre of the tree and a lot of sapwood. It's pretty skinny in some places. This one's got a bit of a bend to it. Again, they're not very wide. In fact, I've looked at it. What I'll do is I'll take an inch or so off this end, even though it's the shorter one, because of this bend, try and get a bit of width there. And I'll run through making a Zed Splice. Now, the basic problem with a splice is to get it lined up. There's no point joining two bits of wood and finding they're not in a straight line. So what you need to do is create what will be your centre line. So if you mark the centre there and the centre of what we're going to make the end here, which is tricky because of this slight bend, you know, we can run a line down it, decide where we want the centre of the bow to be in the finished bow, draw a line there. That's going to become your reference point. Do the same on the other one and hopefully you'll get the two to line up. Now, one of the things to note, this billet's just about wide enough. So if I mark out my Zed Splice, we'll be fine. An easy mistake to make is if you've got a nice chunky wide billet, say this wide, you mark out your Z using the full width, but then by the time the bow is reduced in width, a lot has disappeared off the sides of your splice and you've got a lot less glue line than you thought you had. I'll show you that a bit more when I draw it up on a bit of paper first, just to give a clearer idea. So we'll run through it on paper and then we'll do it for real. Right, now here's our two imaginary billets that we want to splice together nice and straight. And we want to join them together like that. So now if I write back on here, let's write it in the middle. Back and back, so we can't flip them upside down or back to front. And we say, right, well, with this rather wobbly billet we want the centre line to be along there, and with this one we want the centre line actually like that to maximise our wood for cutting out a nice bow. So we'll draw that centre line and we'll draw this centre line, and we immediately see they don't actually line up. Well, that's quite interesting to start with. So the actual finished bow is going to be, because there's always some overlap with the splice which you have to remember. So don't, if you want a 6-foot bow, don't use 3-foot billets. I try and cut my billets about 4 foot. That's what the finished bow will look like. So then we say, right, well, I've tried to make these full size, but obviously not long enough, so they're shorter. But I tend to work in inches for length, but for smaller dimensions I go metric. If you don't like it, hard luck. So first thing we'd do is we'd want a nice square edge across here, and similarly, and that's probably square enough to start with anyway. And if we say, for the sake of argument, the finished bow is going to be 30mm wide, so we'll measure out 15mm there and 15mm there, and if we go 15 here and 15 there, draw a couple of lines. This is what I was talking about before. If we do our Zed Splice in here, that doesn't look very symmetrical. I've probably mismeasured. if we did our Zed splice like that, using the full width of the bow, by the time we reduced the width, all of a sudden our Z would be very much shorter. Do you see what I mean? We've cut down that line and this line to be half the length they were before. And it's the length of the lines that's important. You want a decent glue line. It's the length of glue line that matters. Where have I gone wrong? Yeah, I've measured. That's 15. That's funny. Optical illusion. I'm not that far out with my measurement. Anyway, next question is, how long do you need your V-splice? Well, if it's a self bow, a couple of bits a year or something, you want it as long as possible. The longer the splice, the more the glue line. If you go for a V-splice, you want it even longer. Note carefully, I'm not actually telling you how long. You can look it up elsewhere yourself. I tend not to do V-splices. I've seen some very long ones, 6 and 7 inches, but I've seen I think it was £140 warbow done with a V-splice. The longer the better, because it gives you a longer glue line, more spread of stress, blah blah blah. The caveat is, if you're doing a backed bow where the backing is going to be continuous, then you can go for a very short splice, because all it's doing really is aligning the two halves. The back is what's taking the strain, and if the back is continuous, it's not going to pop. But if you imagine the ultimate in short V-splices is a straight line, so if you imagine a whole bow's glued like that, there's very little stopping it just popping apart at the back. The back is the problem, because the back's in tension. At the belly, in compression, it can't go anywhere, so you haven't got a problem. So you've got to decide on the length of your V-splice. So I'm going to say 3 inches. 3 inches, everybody! Right, there we are. So you draw 3 inches there. Hear the cat scratching away on my target boss. 3 inches there. I should have drawn a 90-degree line across there, which I'll just do by eye. And draw our line there. Now you notice this line ends up right off here, so you think you've got a stupidly long splice, but by the time you've removed that wood, you haven't. It's back to 3 inches. So let's shade in the bit we're going to remove. Take all this off. But he's only marking out one piece of wood, you say. This is the clever thing about a Zed splice. Just going to check I'm still actually on camera. Yeah, I don't know how well this is showing up. What you do is you keep the back uppermost on both bits of paper. You line up your centre line like that. You clamp them and you run them through the bandsaw together. And by the miracles of geometry, it all comes out in the wash. Now again, the difference in theory and practice, this Stanley knife, craft knife, whatever you want to call it, the width of the cut is virtually 0. Of course, a bandsaw blade has finite thickness, so what you find at the bottom of the cut, bottom of the V when cut with a bandsaw, is the width of the bandsaw blade. It's not a perfectly pointed V, so often you get a little hole there, a little gap, but you can compensate for that by, on the corresponding point that goes into there, you can flatten off the end of that a little bit. And that's all part of the fiddling and fettling. So when I get to cut this, rather than cutting to a tiny point, I'll cut back and make it just a little bit wider, the width of me saw blade. But in this case I haven't actually got a saw blade, so I'll pretty much cut it to the line. Right, boys and girls, This is where the magic occurs. We take our two billets that were carefully clamped and glued together, we rotate them and they fit together perfectly in line. Ta-da! That's great, isn't it? You don't believe it, do you? Go and do it yourselves. I had to do it with a piece of paper first time, because you look at it in a book, you see and you think, hey, that don't seem right. But there you go. And that is one of the big advantages with a Zed Splice. It gives you a very good alignment. And now what? If we trim the sides of the bow, if we trim it off to the 13mm that I said in the first place, see, that's quite a good illustration. You can see when you're cutting it on the bandsaw or whatever, or even by hand, it's handy to have a bit of extra width. But the nice thing is, when you come to actually glue it, if you get it down a bit closer to correct width, a G-clamp across there and a G-clamp across there can clamp it all together nicely. So there you are. Well, that's the theory of doing your Zed Splice. On a bandsaw you're going to get a slot there a bit wider, and this point is going to rattle around in it a little bit. So what you can do is you just take that tip off the point with a file or a bandsaw or whatever, just take it off a little bit. That then gets that to sit in snugly. Similarly here, this point, by adjusting the two central prongs, you can get it to nestle in quite nicely. But often you still do end up with a tiny little speck, a tiny little hole there showing. Now back to the other thing, about how strong are these when you bend them. You hear people saying, oh, the middle of a bow doesn't bend if you've got a visor section and all this. Total nonsense. Everything bends. It's a matter of how much, but there's a lot of stress there and a back can pop. If you want to make a totally bomb-proof splice, say you've got two U billets and the backs aren't dead flat and the sapwood doesn't match up very well, you can take a very long shallow scoop, or you can just flatten an area at the back and glue on a thin patch of matching sapwood, and that will just act as a belt and braces. It also gives you an opportunity to slightly round the back of the bow where your grip is, because they can often be a bit flat, but we're getting into nit shit detail there. That's the basis of a V-splice, but cut them together, rotate them, and you're fine. The other thing to note is that's easy to do with something flat machined timber, but an actual stave isn't as easy. But if you try and cut yourself a fairly clean flat reference face so you can push it through the bandsaw, now self-evidently I'm not going to be able to clamp these two together very well, because the top side of this, the back of the bow, is round and wobbly, so it's not going to work with this. I'm not going to be able to cut them both together, but I can mark them individually, bandsaw them individually and do the splice. But I actually do that so you can see it.